Here's a question that should genuinely unsettle you. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, form coordinated groups, plan ambushes, and kill members of rival groups in organized raids. Ants build armies with dedicated soldier castes bred for nothing but combat. And humans, going back tens of thousands of years, show skeletal evidence of organized group violence long before anyone had a word for war. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Is war something humans invented, or something we simply never stopped doing? The instinctive answer most people reach for is that war is a modern invention, a byproduct of civilization, kings, and empires with something to fight over. That answer doesn't survive contact with the evidence. The truth is messier, older, and forces you to separate two very different questions that people constantly mix together. Why does organized group violence exist at all, and why did it eventually take the specific, large-scale, coordinated form we now call war? Let's start with the assumption most people carry without examining it, that war requires civilization, armies, governments, borders worth defending. It doesn't. Evidence for organized lethal violence between human groups stretches back far before any of those things existed. One of the clearest examples comes from a site called Nataruk in modern-day Kenya, where researchers led by Marta Mirazon-Lar discovered the remains of at least 27 individuals dating to roughly 10,000 years ago, showing clear signs of violent death, blunt force trauma, embedded weapon fragments, bound hands on some remains, all in a single event, all before agriculture had even reached that region. This wasn't a lone murder, it was a massacre, and it predates farming, cities, and anything resembling a modern state by thousands of years. Here's where it gets interesting. Chimpanzees do something remarkably similar, and this comparison matters more than it might seem. Primatologist Jane Goodall documented what's now called the Gombe Chimpanzee War in the 1970s, a multi-year conflict where one chimpanzee community split into two groups, and members of the larger group systematically hunted down and killed members of the smaller splinter group over roughly 4 years, one by one, until the smaller group no longer existed. This wasn't chaotic, random aggression. It involved patrols, coordinated attacks, and what researchers describe as deliberate targeting of individuals when the odds clearly favored the attackers. Since chimpanzees and humans share a common ancestor roughly 6 to 7 million years ago, behavior this similar showing up independently in both species suggests the capacity for organized lethal violence between groups may be a genuinely ancient evolutionary inheritance, not something either species separately invented. Now, here's the part nobody talks about. Having the capacity for group violence is not the same thing as war constantly happening. Anthropologists studying small-scale hunter-gatherer societies have found enormous variation. Some groups show frequent, low-level violent conflict with neighboring bands. Others show remarkably little for generations at a time. Researcher Douglas Fry, studying societies with minimal social hierarchy and few defensible resources, has argued that constant warfare wasn't the default human condition everywhere, and that its frequency correlates strongly with specific conditions rather than being a fixed, universal constant of human nature. This is a genuinely contested area of anthropology, and researchers disagree meaningfully on how much prehistoric violence actually occurred and how to interpret the evidence. What most researchers do agree on is that the raw capacity for coordinated group violence is ancient, even if how often it got used varied enormously depending on circumstances. So what were those circumstances? This is where the real shift happened, and it's a genuinely compelling explanation: resource scarcity and defensibility. Small, mobile hunter-gatherer groups with few possessions and the freedom to simply walk away from conflict had less to fight over and less reason to risk death defending a fixed location. Everything changed with agriculture, starting roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Once humans settled permanently to farm specific plots of land, they suddenly had something worth defending that couldn't be abandoned: stored grain, irrigated fields, livestock, and permanent structures representing months or years of accumulated labor. Skeletal evidence from early agricultural sites shows a measurable increase in violent trauma compared to earlier hunter-gatherer populations in many regions. And archaeologists studying early farming settlements across Europe and the Near East have found some of the earliest fortified walls, watchtowers, and defensive structures appearing specifically alongside the earliest agricultural communities, not before them. Here's the layer that connects it to something even bigger: population density and hierarchy. As agricultural surpluses allowed populations to grow larger and settle more permanently, humans began forming increasingly complex social hierarchies, with chiefs, then kings, then centralized states, each layer adding new capacity for organizing larger groups of people toward a shared, coordinated goal. War, in the large-scale, organized sense most people picture, required exactly this kind of infrastructure. Someone with the authority to mobilize hundreds or thousands of people, systems to feed and supply them, and populations large enough to spare a meaningful fraction for combat rather than food production. The earliest evidence of what looks recognizably like organized state warfare, complete with standing armies and centralized command, appears in early civilizations like Sumer and ancient Egypt, roughly 5,000 years ago, directly tracking alongside the emergence of the first true states. There's a fourth layer worth adding, because researchers have proposed a more specific mechanism for exactly how this transition happened: the circumscription theory, developed by anthropologist Robert Carnero. In regions where fertile farmland was geographically boxed in by mountains, deserts, or coastlines, the Nile Valley and coastal Peru are two of the clearest examples. Growing populations couldn't simply spread out and avoid conflict the way groups in open, unbounded territory could. When land ran out and neighbors were unwilling to yield, losing a conflict didn't mean walking away and starting over somewhere else. It meant submission, and often absorption into the winning group's expanding hierarchy. Carnero argued this specific combination of population pressure and geographic boxing in, rather than farming alone, was the actual mechanism that pushed scattered villages towards centralized warlike states. And it's part of why some of history's earliest and most centralized civilizations arose in exactly these geographically constrained regions, rather than in wide-open territory where people had somewhere else to go. There's a fifth layer, too, one that adds an important piece of nuance to the whole picture. Not every complex, populous society scaled up into constant, large-scale warfare. Some agricultural and even early state-level societies show long stretches with comparatively little organized conflict, suggesting that resource pressure and hierarchy make large-scale war possible, but they don't make it automatic or inevitable. Whether it actually happens still depends heavily on specific local conditions, available alternatives like trade or migration, and cultural choices that vary considerably, even among societies facing similar underlying pressures. There's a sixth layer worth adding, because it explains why war persisted and scaled even after those first organized conflicts: ideology and identity. Once humans developed complex language, religion, and cultural identity, group violence stopped requiring an immediate, tangible resource dispute at all. Wars increasingly got fought over shared belief systems, national identity, revenge for past conflicts, and abstract concepts like honor or legitimacy, layered on top of whatever practical resource competition originally existed. This is part of why war never simply faded away, even as resource scarcity became less immediate in wealthier, more developed societies. The underlying capacity for group violence had been repurposed again and again to serve increasingly abstract and symbolic goals. So here's the reframe. Humans didn't invent war so much as inherit the raw capacity for organized group violence from deep evolutionary history, shared at least partially with our closest primate relatives, and then dramatically amplified and reshaped that capacity through agriculture, permanent settlement, population growth, geographic pressure, and hierarchy. The specific, large-scale, organized form we call war, with armies, states, and sustained campaigns, is a genuinely recent invention layered on top of a much older biological foundation. Both things are true simultaneously. The capacity is ancient, and the specific institution is new. And here's the part that connects back to something bigger than history itself. Understanding this distinction actually matters, because if war were purely an unavoidable biological inevitability, there would be little point discussing prevention at all. But the fact that its frequency and scale varied so dramatically across different human societies, shaped heavily by resource conditions, geography, social structure, and available alternatives, suggests something more hopeful hiding underneath the grim evidence. The capacity for violence may be ancient and deeply embedded, but how often humans actually act on it has never been fixed, It's been shaped, again and again, by the specific conditions we build around ourselves, which means it can still be reshaped.